Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is Mary B. Roberts interviewing Mrs. Bingham and Alva. Testing, testing. This is Mary B. Roberts. I'm interviewing for the Living Legends Library of the Oklahoma City Historical Society and Oklahoma Christian College. The interviewee is Mrs. Maude A. Drake-Bingham of Alva. This is October 24th, 1972. The next voice you hear will be that of Mrs. Bingham.
How close? This is Maude A. Drake-Bingham, Alva, Oklahoma. M-A-U-D, no E, A, Drake, hyphen, Bingham. My father's name? My father's name was Elmer D. Drake. Made the run into Oklahoma in 1893. My mother's name, Laura L. Laura Lily Leeds. Where they were born.
Could you tell us something about your brothers and sisters and perhaps some of the genealogy of your family?
I only had one sister, born in 1895 here in Oklahoma. The family, my sister has become quite a famous genealogist. She had pneumonia one time, and before she went to the hospital, she grabbed her books up, and while she was in there, prepared for publication 5 generations of Mary Wentworth, because that was our direct ancestor. The book sells for 10 and a half, which is more than most of us can do when we're in the hospital. Mary Wentworth married Elder Brewster of the Mayflower. And of course, since they are our direct ancestor, we're much interested in the fact that he was the oldest, the only college graduate on the Mayflower, while the separatists who took out from England and went to Holland, he was being the only college graduate, taught in the Holland University. Sister has been there, where there are 2 rooms set aside for memorabilia from Elder Brewster. He was the main writer of the compact, which is the beginning of our own Constitution.
I understand that the Mormons have been interested in the collection that of data included in your sister's genealogy.
When Sister has been working on this genealogy of our own family, it never impressed me very much because it was in the past and I couldn't do a thing about things that have gone past. I only was interested in the tomorrows that I might change. But one day I said to my sister, she said, "You're not very interested in this." And I said, "Well, if you could trace our genealogy back to the barons who got old King John down and made him sign that Magna Carta, I would be very much interested, because then I would know why it was I always had to fight my way through life." When she got through with that work, we were direct descendants of every one of the 17 of the Magna Carta who had progeny. So I will have to admit that now I know why I've had to fight all the battles I have fought in life. However, they've been most delightful ones, and I've enjoyed every one of these fights. Her book on the ancestor covers 4 terrific volumes, great big volumes, and since they are so complete, the Mormons have come to her for permission to microfilm the whole genealogy and put it in that limestone cave where they are keeping all of these sacred records. So they will be there some of these days, for it is about finished. I have 4 big volumes of this family history. My father was born in New York State. No, my father's father and mother were born in New York State. They moved to McGregor, Iowa, when my grandfather came back from the Civil War. He and grandmother were married. She was 15, he was 17. He'd put in a good deal of time in the prisons at that time, and they became pioneers. From that day to this, grandfather and grandmother moved to McGregor, Iowa, where my father was born. Then they, when he was a young child, 4 or 5 years old, they moved on to western Kansas when it was opened, driving the blue oxen, which is a part of my precious memories. Out there, my grandmother had 3 other children that they brought to maturity, and my mother's people came from Indiana to central Kansas, where my father and mother met and were married in 1886. I was born in 1887 in central Kansas. Kansas City, the center. Kansas City, Kansas Center. The center, supposedly, of Kansas. It is no longer extant. It very soon moved to a little town of Frederick. From Frederick, we pioneered into Oklahoma in 1894. My father had made the run in 1893, and we had 6 months to get on to that claim. My father had preceded us, had built a little granary in which we lived until the sod house was finished, where my sister was born. And we lived until we moved from that to Alva to enter the college, which was another dream.
May I ask just a little bit more about the sod house?
Well, I think I could build a sod house. You took a sod plow and plowed a 12-inch furrow about 3 inches thick. You took a spade and you cut each one of those pieces that were turned over. 2 were laid side by side. The next 2 were laid the other way, side by side. When you finished, you had a wall that was 2 feet thick, tightly held together with roots of Bermuda grass. When you got to the top, you built a series of 2x6s across the top, upon which you laid boards that you bent down until you had what was known as a car roof, a bent over roof, and on top of that you laid 2 thicknesses of sod. Ours was quite a big house. It was quite imposing. It had 2 rooms, 14 by 16 each. And we had a nice, warm house. The window ledges were 2 feet deep because the windows were set on the outside of the wall. So you had plenty of place for storage or for your pets to live in the inside of the window. You didn't have whatnots to set there as we do today. You had little live ducks or rabbits or squirrels or things that were your playthings. That was the only kind I knew in those days.
Tell us something about the run, the day your father, where did he make it from, and about where did he make his claim?
My father and his father worked together at this central town in Kansas.
It's not a very strong night, but about like that.
In Frederick, Kansas. And outside, Grandfather had land. I think maybe they traded. They claimed they had taken in western Kansas for this land in central Kansas. Anyway, my father and grandfather worked together. They had quite a herd of horses. They thought if they went down to the border, which would be along about where Wellington is today, they might get a better price for these horses. So they took 30 of these horses and went down purely to sell the horses. They did sell the horses at a very good price, but they had 2 horses left that had not sold. And it was just quite natural that they had to use them, so they made the run. They staked claims in on this run and came to Alva to have the registration to the land office. Grandfather slipped up the line where Father was standing in line to file on his claim with a note that he laid in front of Father saying, "File on this number instead of the one you have staked. I have bought this relinquishment from the man who had it, and it joins my place." Grandfather had already filed. So Father filed on an unknown quarter, but it joined my grandfather. Then my grandfather bought another relinquishment for another son who had his farm right across the road from us. So we had 3 family farms joining each other with nothing but a road between. We were there for the 5 years that was necessary to prove up the claim. And those were very important years because there were things that each one of us were to do. My job was to get in the kindling always. That was my job, for we burned cow chips, and my father had bought a new hand-operated corn sheller, and as it was shelled and the seed used for planting and for stock feed and so on, the cobs fell to the ground. It was my business to get those in the house to burn. An incident occurs in here, this would have been in about 1894, that I think I should tell because it is opposed to everything the scientists say. But I know this happened. My father thought it was a hawk that was stealing my mother's chickens. They had brought a few, and of course she had garnered and cared for these little chickens that were growing up. Now, we'd been here several months, and a hawk kept getting Mother's chickens. A neighbor complained that a hawk was getting their little chickens. My father followed the hawk out to the fence where he had landed on a post and shot him. When he fell, my father discovered it was not a hawk. It was a bald eagle, and my father wouldn't have shot a bald eagle for anything in the world. But he threw him in the big wagon. And when he came back in a little while, there sat the eagle on the end gate of the big wagon, madder than a hatter. His brows were pulled down, and one wing was hanging loosely. My father put him in the corn crib, and every day my father saw to it that he was fed. He got him a live ground squirrel or rabbit or something. It had to be alive. He would not touch a dead animal that they put in there. He wanted to kill it himself and tear it to pieces himself. I can remember there were some scenes between my father and mother that were not so good when my mother discovered that Dad was using some of her chickens when he couldn't find the proper rabbit or squirrel to feed the eagle. But he would grab one of those live creatures and just tear it to pieces with his sharp beak and his talons and just gobble it down, sure. And he was in the corn crib where he had all of the grain he wanted to eat. To me, I suspect the one thing in life that has had more influence on my life than any other one item that I can think of was that eagle, because I adored him. I stood and watched through the slats of the corn crib day after day because I just worshipped him. And he looked at me with all of the meanness that could possibly be. He scowled, he snarled at me, but I adored him, and he knew I adored him. Well, fall came, and they began bringing in the corn that was shucked, not taken from the cob, but shucked corn was brought in the big wagons, and the hired man pitched these scoopfuls of corn in, and that beautiful eagle stood on top of the pile of corn and took every scoopful of corn that came in there that fall on his chest, knocking him the length of the corn crib. But before another scoopful could be in, he was back up on the top looking madder than ever. But it did something to him. There was something outside in that outside world that he wanted and that he remembered about. And one day, while I was picking up the cobs that had been shelled and getting them ready to go in the house, I was hanging by one hand to the slat of the corn crib, when all at once I lifted off of the ground. Now, this is what the scientists say can't happen, but I'm telling you it did happen. I was lifted off because this eagle had taken me by that hand that was hanging and carried me up to where the pump was, which was above the sod house roof, and I could look down on the roof where my mother had sheets laid out and the peaches and apricots drying in the sun the way you put up the dried fruit in those days. Pretty soon it turned, he dropped to me and I fell to the ground, and I was yelling for my mother to come and see because the eagle had flown away and he had taken me a piece with him. I have to this day, which you could scarcely see at my age, but there are scars across my hands still showing where it tore out as I fell. I've forgotten things. I got ahead of my story.
Story about the eagle. I'm so glad you gave us that. Uh, Now then, let's go back to where your father and his father came into Oklahoma.
Father and grandfather had got the claims. They came back and reported that they had 6 months to get us onto the claims. And, of course, the process of getting everything ready began. We came with quite a caravan, as I remember. I've tried to remember who drove what, but I'm unable to remember many. There was a header box. Now, most people of today don't know what a header barge is, but it was low on one side, had a great big bed, low on one side, high on the other. It was made to go along with the wheat cutting, along with the header, which was a later invention.
Okay.
Our caravan consisted of this header barge, upon which was all of the machinery and the furniture and my doll box. That's a funny combination, because here was a covered wagon, and in the covered wagon was the bedding and beds for Dad and Mother. I don't know where I slept. I remember I rode with my mother, who drove the chuck wagon, upon which a spring wagon, on the back of which my father had fixed a most effectual cupboard, kitchen cupboard, with all of the food that was going to be needed, not only for the trip, but for our lives ahead, until such time as we could get food and raise food and do all of those things. My clothing, it was winter. We came in March. That was a bad time of year. So here was the header barge, and here was the covered wagon, and here was the chuck wagon. Then there was quite a herd of horses and cattle. My father had a brother and a sister. They were younger. They rode horses and kept this herd with the caravan. And that was our caravan as we came into Oklahoma. There were no roads across in this. You just headed toward where you were going. When I was grown, we were still doing that. You knew that the town you were headed for was that direction, whatever that direction was. And there were no fences. You just started out. After a while you got there, because you knew your directions. That's why those of us who were really pioneers live in a world that must have directions. Time I spent in the mountainous country of Arkansas or up in the mountains of Colorado was miserable, because I never know the directions. And to me, north and south and east and west are absolutely essential, just as essential as the food you eat. I don't know how to live in a world that doesn't have definite directions. I could go to any town if I just knew what direction that town was and about what angle it was from where I was. As I grew, we came to Oklahoma. I wanted to tell you this. We came to the Nenasko River. This was March. Things were very cold. It was very cold. I dearly adored the sleeping outdoors. That didn't make any difference. Of course, we didn't know what a sleeping bag was, but we knew how to sleep by the campfire and keep warm with what covers we understood and knew. Or maybe we slept on the top of a haystack. I can remember sleeping on top of a haystack, and I dearly adored it because you could see the sky and the stars, and it was so beautiful. I don't remember anything about what we had to eat, but I know we ate meals all the way down. We had our regular meals, but we came finally to the Nenasko River. Today I couldn't tell you where the Nenasko River is, but we camped on the north side of the Nenasko River because it was too late in the afternoon to cross that night. The next morning, we were ready to cross the Nenasko. My father drove the header barge with 4 horses onto that ice. It held them up. Wagon and horses and everything until he hit the middle of the river, and all at once the whole thing gave way, and 4 horses were struggling for their lives in that flood water. The ice flows were perfectly terrible. The hired man and the others ran with axes to try to chop the ice ahead of the horses so that they could get out. We were all day crossing the Nenasko River. I suppose that we were cold that day. I don't remember anything about that, but we were getting toward Oklahoma. And I know about the next night or two, my father found a homestead and begged them to let us sleep inside their house, the first time we had ever slept in the house. I didn't know why at the time, but my father knew I was sick. It was the beginning of a long spell of typhoid fever, which I had as soon as we landed in Oklahoma and got moved into the granary that Dad had gone ahead to build. It was a little room, I suppose, 10 by 16, 12 by 16 maybe. But it was for the granary, but we could live in it until we got the house built. And as spring came on, we began the building of our sod house that we were going to have in Oklahoma. And I tell my friends always, I could build a sod house if I had to. I know exactly how they did it. You got a sod plow, you broke this sod 12 inches wide, it turned over beautifully full of buffalo roots, and you laid 2 side by side, and you went on around the house that way. Then you came back and you laid 2 side by side going the other way, which gave you a 2-foot wall. When you got to the top, you built a scaffolding across to hold your roof, and on top of that bended roof, known as a car roof in those days, you laid 2 thicknesses of sod, the same as you had as you came up. And that there was never any leak. I never remember a leak in the house, but that gave you a 2-foot thick wall, which was warm and cozy. We were very affluent. We had a floor made of lumber. My mother didn't want a dirt floor, but most of the sod houses had dirt floors. But my dad and my mother were sort of aristocrats. My dad never would eat off of an oilcloth tablecloth, never. My mother never would have anything but a white tablecloth. I never remember a colored tablecloth. A broken cup was never on the table, or somebody would have had a spasm about it and would have told all of us about that. That was no thing to have on. As my sister has hunted the family history back, she finds that my father is a direct descendant of King Edward I, the man who gave the parliamentary rule to England. King Edward I had a first wife who died. My father's ancestry goes straight back to that first wife. Then King Edward I married a woman, a princess, who later was known as a saint, Saint Margaret of Scotland. And my mother's history goes straight back to King Edward I and Queen Margaret. So I have thought maybe there was a little bit of aristocracy in both of them, because as mother grew older and there became a little money in the family, I was teaching in college, and my mother would come to visit me. I was always proud of her because her clothes were just beautiful, and she had some of the cleverest little hats I've ever seen. And I was proud to introduce her as my mother because she was a beautiful woman and she spoke well. She became quite a politician later in life. I'm talking about the heritage of these. She became quite a politician. Later in life. I'm talking about the heritage of these. She became quite a politician, and I used to take her to these political meetings where the men would come, the leaders, and they would put their arms around her and kiss her and tell her how glad they were she was there, till I told her I wasn't going to take her anymore because she just acted terrible at these meetings. But she seemed to think it was perfectly all right. But I'll tell you one thing, when they had her make a speech, she could say more in 2 minutes than most of the politicians would say when they spoke an hour and a half. There's something else interesting about Mother that I want to tell you. When my mother was born, she was a twin. She and an identical sister, twins. The two of them together weighed 3 pounds. They laid side by side in a cigar box. That is over 100 years ago. And my grandmother was too sick to nurse these babies. Of course, there were brothers and sisters that were up around 20 years old, but my grandfather was so proud of these babies that he took care of them himself. And he raised them on pap, P-A-P, pap. I said to Grandfather, "What was pap, Grandfather?" He said, "Well, you took a graham cracker and you put 2 or 3 drops of real good fresh cream on it and poured some boiling water over it. And that was pap, and that's what I raised those babies on." They were so identical that they had to be marked, one with a blue ribbon and one with a pink, when they were born, because even their own sisters couldn't tell which was Laura and which was Dora. Even I, when I was growing up, couldn't tell which was which. If I said, "May I do this?" whatever it was, if she said, "No, certainly not," that was my mother. If she said, "Well, I can't see any reason why that wouldn't be all right," that was my Aunt Dora. That's the only way I could tell them apart. My father couldn't tell them apart when he was about to marry my mother. And he decided a couple of weeks before the wedding that he would mark my mother so he'd know that he was marrying the right one. His cufflinks had sets in. He opened the one of those little prongs that holds the set to mark my mother, and deliberately aggravated her into a little wrestling match in which she grabbed his hand. Where he was intending to get a mark on her hand, he got it across her forehead, and it almost broke up the wedding. But when he married her, he was marrying the right one anyway. So there was much fun, and all of their lives, these two had fun about this. Clear to their dying day, my mother went to her sister's deathbed, and and the doctor said, turned and gave her, she went to the doctor to get a report on her sister. And he was so mad at her, he said, I told you to stay in bed, what are you out here for? And she said, wait a minute, doctor, this isn't the one you think it is, this is her twin sister. And he said, well, don't tell me I don't know Mrs. Davis. And just at that instant, a dentist who was in the same office came in, and he said, wait a minute, doctor, let me see your teeth. And he looked at her and he said, doctor, this is not Mrs. Davis. I didn't make these teeth. So you see, clear to the end of life, they still were having fun at being twins.
We're going to have to turn the tape now. This is an interview, and it will be continued on side 2. This is continuation of the interview with Mrs. Bingham of Alva, Oklahoma. Miss Bingham, suppose we start now with your education in this new land. And would you please continue that through your wonderful preparation that you made and for your teaching and so on?
Fine, thank you. I'm afraid I wasn't destined to be a scholar. Up in Kansas, they started me at school. But it rained that day most beautifully. And my boyfriend, Nomer Murray, and I went out and waded in the water up to our knees and better until when we came in from recess, the teacher sent us home to get dried out. The next time they sent me to school, it was snow and ice. And Nomer took a broom and swept the pond, and he and I, instead of going to school as we should and as we were sent, we went and skated all day on the pond because the ice was beautiful and we had a wonderful time skating, but we were pretty wet with the snow and ice. So we stopped at some old lady's house where there was a roaring fire in a cook stove. I remember that well. And we got all dried out before we went home. And then, do you know what? That teacher came and called on my mother and told her that I had not been in school. And finally, it was spring anyway, and it was about time to start for Oklahoma, so I guess I didn't go to school anymore. I don't think I was much of a scholar. It didn't seem so there. But when we got into Oklahoma, there weren't any schools. And as soon as my father got the sod house built, he and the neighbors all went together, and they built a schoolhouse in the middle of our district, which was not balanced. They built a school. The school was built of lumber, but there was no furniture for the school. They built some seats around 4 poles that went up in the center of the schoolhouse, and the stove was in the middle of that. And you could sit on that. Otherwise, people brought their own chairs. I didn't have anything but a rocking chair, and I took the rocking chair. But I had the misfortune of having to go to my relatives. I thought if I ever got to where I didn't have to go to my relatives, it would be better. But anyway, my aunt was the teacher. She was a beautiful lady and quite my favorite. She'd gone to school in Winfield. But the next thing I knew, my rocking chair was nailed to the floor. So I didn't rock anymore. I think I was disturbing the school, probably, was why. But I was there in that school 2 years, maybe, when an incident occurred. I was a good horsewoman. My father said I was better with the horses than any hired man. I could ride them, I could harness them, I could hitch them up. It was all a part of being a pioneer child. I knew how. The horses liked me and I liked them. I had a special job in the summer. My job was to take the milk to the creamery in Byron. Nobody had individual separators in those days. You took the 10-gallon cans of milk to the creamery. They lifted it out and separated it and put the cans of separated milk back in your spring wagon so it could be taken home to feed the animals there. One morning that I took the milk there, I woke up with a strange presentiment. I don't know what, but I woke up crying, which I seldom did because I wasn't a crying child. My mother was worried about it. It was harvest time, and she wanted to know what was the matter. I said nothing. I couldn't tell you why I was crying. I didn't know why. But I didn't seem to want to go with the milk that morning. Well, she said she would go herself, and I said, that is silly. In harvest, and of course I'll go, which I did. I got the milk separated. I saw the doctor, who was a very dear friend of mine. He was hitching up his horse, and I said, where are you going, Doc? And he said, out to the country 30 miles. Somebody was very sick there. And I wished him well and drove on toward home. A couple of miles out of Byron, the lines of one horse caught the reins, caught over the hames of the other one. I flipped those lines to try to get them off. The flies were bad. The horses hesitated, sort of backed up a little, and the wheel bent in, the right wheel, toward the, well, I had been trained by the hired man to ride with my right foot on the step, which I had, and the wheel turned around toward the step. In the little struggle to get the reins straightened out, my foot caught in that wheel and began to wrap around the hub of the inside. My foot went through the wheel, past three spokes, came back, past 2 spokes, and went back out. And all the time I was trying to keep my hair from under the back wheel, which was trying to run over my head. And I was clinging to anything I could get hold of. I was holding my hair in my teeth and so on to try to keep that braid from going under. And all at once I looked at my knee, which had a big knot sticking up, which was the knee bone. It was broken on both sides and was just ready to snap my right leg off as it threw me up over. I saw the reins on the round of the tongue and grabbed them and spoke to the horses and began to back them up till my leg was straight and I could get it out of that wheel, which I did. I couldn't climb in over the step. I couldn't make it. Now, you don't need to ask me how I ever got over the dashboard, but that's the way I got in. When I turned immediately around and went back to Byron because I was so afraid I would miss the doctor. And a little girl that had ridden out a ways with me saw me and came running when I called her to help me drive. I said, I've broken my leg and I need to get back to doctor. And she ran in the house to the doctor and said, come quick, Dr. Maude's broken her leg. Well, he carried me in Well, it was broken in so many places that they couldn't bandage it without bandaging the blood in. Moreover, I had fallen. As I had fallen, I had scraped my back on that step as I went down, till it was all raw as it went down. Blood poison and gangrene set in both in my back and in my leg, and at the end of 10 days, they had to get a surgeon from Wichita to come and amputate the leg. This changed the pattern of life a good deal for me. I couldn't do the things that I had always done and wanted to do. But I had, as I look back, I know I had the most wonderful parents that one could ever have, because my father said, "Now, daughter, we would not have had this happen for anything in the world, but it has happened. And this doesn't mean that you're not going to do the things that you were destined to do. You're going to go right on with your work, no matter what that work proves to be, but we're going to educate you now." So that fall, as soon as I began to get well enough to be up, they took me to the Stella Friends Academy. The Quakers had come into Oklahoma and had built some of these academies throughout the country. And I was there for one term. The dormitory was not open. The dining room was not open. The dormitory was open, and I had a girl in our neighborhood, was 18 years old. She wanted awfully to go to school, but they didn't have the money. My father paid her tuition and paid for the rental of the room if she would take care of me. I went to Stella Friends Academy. Mostly eyes and forehead, and 64 pounds of me, along with the smell of iodoform, which was the great disinfectant of those days. The end of my leg, you could have set a good-sized cup in, so I had to be taken home every week to the doctor to have that rebandaged. You can imagine what a little sick youngster like that could do in a higher education. I had no more idea than a rabbit how to study or anything else, except that my father and mother were both school teachers. And one of the first things in our home my father provided was a beautiful little blackboard over in the corner where every night my arithmetic and my spelling went on there. Mother taught me the reading. And it was all done every night. So when I was in this academy, I realized I had to study, but all lights had to be out at 9 o'clock. Well, it took us about that long to get some supper, build fires, which I didn't know how to do, and things like that. But every week when the folks came, they brought cooked foods and cooked chickens and roasts that were cooked and ready to eat and so on. So I don't fancy we did very much cooking. I don't remember the cooking. I didn't know how to cook, and I didn't know how to build the fires and that sort of thing. I can remember sitting on the floor and scooting along, trying to scrub the floor, and I couldn't make the bed. But anyway, I got a term at the Stella Friends Academy. So I was getting some training of whatever it was. That fall, they were building the castle in Alva, the castle that was to become the inspiration of my life, the inspiration of all of the youth of northwestern Oklahoma. There are stories on that I think ought to be recorded, and I don't know that they are. We had a representative, I don't know if he was a representative or whether he was in the Senate. Anyway, he was in our legislature, a Mr. Vickers, who was our political influence, and he got a bill through to establish a college in Alva. Behind this is still another, is the man who had the dream. We had a school superintendent here in Alva who had a dream of a college on the hill. He talked to everybody that he could find to talk to about that college that we're going to have on the hill. He talked to Mr. Vickers. He talked to anybody who would listen. I remember one night my father was late getting home, and my mother said, "Why are you so late getting to supper?" from his work. And he said, "I met Mr. Ross downtown, and he talked all this time about the college that we're going to have on that hill." I think that man deserves a lot, and I've never heard any praise. And I'm happy to take this time to set this down. The man who had the dream. Well, Mr. Vickers got the bill through to put this college here. He got appropriated, listen, he got appropriated $5,000 to build the building, hire the faculty, and run that college for 2 years. I want you to think what that means. But the faith of people is what thrills my heart as I remember. There was a man graduating from Terre Haute, Indiana, the name of that college I can't think of. He was one of the greatest college professors I've ever known. He was hired as president of this college before it was built. He accepted the job. He came here. My understanding from my father and other men was that he walked the walls of that college with a pistol in his pocket, threatening any man who dared to put a poor piece of workmanship or a poor brick in that college wall. And the college grew. And that fall, the fall of 1898, the college opened. And I, 12 years old, was standing as close as I could be to that door when it opened. And in I went. I supposed, you see, in those days, there were no grades of schools. Nobody knew what a grade was. I never heard of such a thing as gradation in schools. There were 2 years of subnormal. I supposed, of course, I'd be down in that bunch of dumbbells. But I had been one term at Stella Friends Academy, and I was registered as a freshman. There never was a poorer equipped freshman entered. I can look back at that grade card to this day. I don't know whether it burned in when the castle burned or not. But all of my grades in that first year were 3s. They graded 1, 2, 3 in those days. 1 was A. 1 was top. 3 was down low. Down in the sophomore year, there weren't very many 3s. There were 2s and some 1s. In the senior, they were all 1s. I'd like to have that card preserved because, you see, while I wasn't destined as a scholar, I proved to my father and to my mother that at least I was trying. That amounted to something in my world. I developed certain philosophies in those things. The philosophy of pay your debts, stand on your own legs. Don't be something that somebody has to help. I remember one time on the farm, the government became concerned about the starving homesteaders of Oklahoma. of the Strip. And they sent a carload of salbelly and beans. Now that's a perfectly good word, and you don't need to, because that's exactly what it was, salbelly and beans. Our neighbor to the north, John Eller, had come in and came out with a load of salbelly and beans. And he stopped to give my father some because they had told him to give this to all of the starving homesteaders. The government had sent it for them. My father said, "John, I'm awfully glad you have this because you have 8 children to take care of, and I'm delighted. But you know, we're getting on just fine, and we don't need it." That, like my eagle, was something that stuck with me. I don't want the government to take care of me. I don't want something for free. I want to work for it, and then I'll be doggone if I want anybody to take it away from me. That's mine, and that's my philosophy. Do you know where we are?
I believe you have just entered the college, the castle, and you have had your first report card. Now then, let's go on from there, and I understand you were Lyceum and Chautauqua and a graduate of the Emerson School of Expression, besides an interesting career in teaching. Now let's have a little bit on some of these.
Well, I graduated from the college in 1904. A friend of mine had to introduce me to an alumni meeting one night, and she said Maude wasn't very smart, which of course I knew, but I didn't think it ought to be advertised. She said she was in our class. She was supposed to graduate with us, but it took her 5 years to graduate when it only took us 4. We graduated in 1903, and when I stood up before that audience, I was dumbfounded because for the soul of me, I couldn't remember what she was talking about. Well, that night, in the middle of the night, I woke up practically laughing. I thought what it was. That was the year they had added 1 year's work to the college. Up to that time, it had been a 3-year course. This precious friend of mine died, and I never had a chance to get even with her because never could I remember a thing to say. I've thought out I would tell her sometime publicly that I was much smarter. That's why I had that extra year. But I never got a chance to. She died before I had a chance to get even with her. But from this school, during the time I was a senior, I had decided that the thing I wanted to do was to teach speech, reading, drama, all of that interesting field. I have to intrude this. President Ament, when he came here to this school, he brought one of the most terrific faculties I've ever known. They were experts. In the head of speech was Professor Abbott, who was incidentally the trainer of was the man who made Dale Carnegie. Professor Abbott wouldn't stand a word that was mispronounced. He wouldn't tolerate a slang word. He was a perfectionist in the speech field. If I said, oh, stuff like that, I got a terrible calling down. That was a marvelous faculty. You did it right. You were a lady. You didn't use the language of the gutter. I had wonderful training. I had said to my father, I want to go on to college somewhere else when I graduate. My father and mother had both had to teach country schools, and they both had thought that I should teach 1 year of a country school because there was much to be learned in a country school. I grant that's true. But the day that we graduated from the castle, I was ready to go to Chicago. My father had written letters to all of the great schools. He liked the letter he got from Mary A. Blood, who was the president there. So the next degree I got was a diploma from Columbia College. I had a little extra time on my hands, at least I thought I did. I could commit rather rapidly, and I had a whole program, some 63 numbers, one of them a long one, ready to do a concert as soon as I got home from that first summer's work. So I went to Chicago to Mary A. Blood. There again, we had teachers who were tremendous powers, and teachers who were in the professional work. In this spare time I had, I went over to Bryant and Stratton Business College and took some extra courses in business, because I wanted to be able to make $1 and know what to do with it. And they said to me, where have you had your college? And I said, in Oklahoma. And the president of that school said, well, where were you trained? There aren't any colleges in Oklahoma. That was Chicago for you. But I graduated from Columbia College of Expression under Mary A. Blood. Then I came back. Well, I taught that year in the country school. 45 classes a day, 8 to 10 minutes per class. I learned that there was a lot to learn in a country school. But that was the last of the country school. The next year, eight to 10 minutes per class, I learned that there was a lot to learn in a country school. But that was the last of the country school. The next year, I was subpoenaed to teach in a new Quaker academy that was put in at Lawrence Friends Academy out in Beaver County. It was Beaver then. Beaver, all of those 3 counties were one then. I read in a book here not very long ago that I was the principal. I was 18 then. I was the principal of the first accredited high school west of Woodward. I didn't want them to know how old I was because I had students who were 23, 4 years old who had been in Ann Arbor the year before, and they referred to me as Professor Drake. So I very carefully kept this 18-year-old business under my hat. Several years later, I was out there to give a program, and in introducing me, they said, "We don't know how old she is yet because she never did tell us how old she was when she was here." And all I could think of to say was, "I'm not as old now as I was when I was here." Because I was 20 or 26 then. From Columbia College of Expression, I took special work under, whatever, Elias Day, for instance. Then I enrolled in Elias Day's school. Remember, I was teaching every year. I would teach till 4 o'clock, catch a 4:17 train to Kansas City or to Chicago, wherever, and be there for the summer term, catch just about the same connection, and get back for the first day of school. I taught in Edmond for 4 years, then I came back to Alva, and I taught here from 1910 or 11, I can't think which, until 1915, when my sister graduated in 1915, and my principal job, writing her and my sister, was finished. Moreover, I had been teaching in the college for 4 years for $75 a month. Don't think I'm complaining. I'm the richest person in the world, and I appreciate it. But I'm telling you this merely because bad disposition comes out, and mine came out unexpectedly to me even. The order came around, "You have been elected for next year at the same price. Write yes or no." It happened between classes that this was handed to me. I walked to the wall and I wrote a great big, disgracefully big no. And to add insult to injury, I drew a great big heavy line under it, which tore the paper that went back to the Board of Regents, and I knew I was in trouble because President Grumbine could bark loud and scare the daylights out of me. So I grabbed my hat. It was 11 o'clock, and I didn't happen to have a class, and I flew for home. And the telephone rang. It was President Grumbine, and he said, "Miss Maude, when will you be back?" And I said I hadn't intended to come back. Lie number one. And he said, "Then I'll come right down to the house. I want to talk to you." And I said, "I'll be there at 2 o'clock. Well, will you come to the office?" "Yes." So at 2 o'clock, I was in his office, and he said, of all things, "Miss Maude, how much will it take to keep you?" And I said, "I don't know that I'd be interested at twice the money." Well, he said, "That's all right, we can get it." And I said, "What? How? Why can you get it?" "Well, because you're worth it." And I said, "President, if I was worth it and you didn't get it for me, I don't want it at any price." So, with that, I was on the road to Honolulu. I said I will go out there and I will take a year in the university there and I'll get a master's degree. So, I went to the university in Honolulu and I got all of my credentials. everything, letters from the governor and the senators and my grade sheets and everything else. And I got called in to the president's office immediately, and he said, "Miss Drake, do you know that you have credits in everything we offer except beekeeping and something else?" I've forgotten what the other thing was, but I didn't want to keep a bee, and I didn't know what to do. I went back to my hotel, and I thought, what do I do now? This is costing me money, and here I am 10,000 miles from home, and the thing I thought I was going to do, I can't do. What do I do? God help me. The next morning I had an inspiration, or during the night, I went to the territorial director of public instruction, superintendent of public instruction, and I showed him all of my credentials and my grades and told him my tragedy at the university. He grabbed all of my papers and shot out of that room and was gone for 45 minutes. I knew I was turned down. I didn't get anywhere with him, but I had to have my papers. That was all I had between me and starvation. I didn't dare. I didn't dare give up. I had to have those papers. Well, finally, he came back with the president of the normal school. They looked me over, and I don't know what they saw, but the first thing I knew, I was teaching in the normal school in Honolulu. And my job was to train teachers. Well, I didn't know there were 70 nationalities in the world until I got to that school, but we had 70 nationalities. And I had very definitely not one, but 70 language problems, because they couldn't speak English and I had no idea what they were saying. But anyway, we got on pretty well. I couldn't stand I couldn't stand what my precious teachers were teaching, even though I'd gone through that stack a foot high of lesson plans that they had written for me. And I did most of the teaching myself, thinking they could learn something from me, but boy, I had to be a good teacher. And I tried with all the power I had to really teach those many. Several of my children had TB very bad, and TB was bad out there. I had one little boy that had leprosy, and he was sent to Lepers Island. I had one little boy that I had begged to have from the reformatory, and he proved to be quite a trial to me because he wouldn't conform to anything I told him to do, and of course there was a rule: you must never touch a child. So this particular time when Napoleon, this bad little boy, refused to do anything. He wouldn't do anything that I tried to get him to do. And finally I went back and I shook him and I banged him around every possible way I could, and with every sense of, anyway, as soon as I got that done, I said, you take your books and go home, and until you can behave yourself and act like a gentleman, don't you come back to this school. So I followed him out, and I went to the president's office, which was just across the hall, And the walls were only built up a certain ways, and the rest was all open around, so I knew the president had listened to the whole thing. And I said, Mr. President, I just whipped Napoleon. And he said, I hope you did a good job. So I didn't lose my job. I was still there. But the conservatory in Chicago had offered me the presidency of the conservatory the year before, and I had turned it down. I said, I'm not learned enough. I haven't traveled enough. I'm not material for that. I will go back and finish my work at the college because I am supposed to finish this year with them. I will go if in a year's time I've had more learning or more travel. I will let you know. Well, my trip around the world, which I had planned, was sadly interrupted by the war which was on at the time. And my job in Beijing, China, which I had, where they were going to pay me $3,000 a year plus my living expenses, because I would live at the school. My passport was canceled because they were afraid of another Boxer uprising such as they had had. So I wrote to the conservatory in Chicago and told them my problem, and told them as humbly as I knew how. If they thought I wasn't very much smarter, and I sure wasn't much more traveled or much more lettered than I was, but if they wanted me to let me know. I got a cable back to be there in time to take over the summer school. So I had to leave the school, the normal school in Hawaii, about a half a week early. But the president's secretary had handled them before, and she promised me she would take them. So I went to Chicago and taught there in the conservatory. I already had a degree from there, incidentally, which they would not grant. That's the one degree in the world that I value, because they wouldn't grant it just because you finished their courses. They would not grant it until you could show them 3 years of increased salary plus higher positions. Then they would grant you that degree. And I think that's the way the world ought to be run. It shouldn't give us anything until we've earned it, definitely.
I have asked the question of her experience with the Lyceum and the Chautauqua circuits, and it occurred to me that perhaps there are some of our listeners that might not know what the old Lyceum and Chautauqua systems were and how they were organized. I wonder if you could help us out on that.
The Lyceum circuit was one of the greatest entertainment circuits we've ever had in America, because it was far-reaching. It went all over the United States. Slayton and Red-Pass had a bureau, an organization bureau in Chicago. Boston had their own, I can't call the names of the Boston and New York circuit people, but anyway, they would sell their companies to these others where they booked them. every little town like Alva would buy a Chautauqua program. It lasted about 10 days. There were programs. There was an enormous tent built out in the park that would seat several thousand. Everybody bought a season ticket to Chautauqua. The college would buy a winter circuit of 5 or 6 numbers. These sold for whatever, depending upon what the company was. If it was a big company, a musical company with many people in, that cost more. I was with the Chicago Slayton Lyceum Bureau in Chicago for 1 year. They sent us on the longest run they had ever had. It was called the Transcontinental Trio because they were picked from all over the country. There was George Cutter, a musician and a comedian from Boston. There was, we had so many singers because we put them in the hospital so many times that our travels were long. And there was Maude Drake-Bingham, the most unknown of the lot, from Oklahoma, the middle of the United States. We were sometimes we traveled any way we could travel, usually by train, but sometimes to get from this railroad to another railroad, you'd have to take a trip by horses across from one to the other, maybe in the middle of the night. We had jumps that averaged around 500 miles a day, which doesn't mean very much to us today with our speedy trains and all, but in those days that wore you down because you had a concert to put on. Now, we were not show people. There was nothing made our group so unhappy as to have somebody refer to us as the show troupe. We were a concert troupe. There was a singer who was a beautiful singer. There was George Cutter, who did most of the accompanying work for her. And he himself was a comedian who sat down at the piano, played his own accompaniments, and read or half sang clever, cute things that were lots of fun. He was the lighter element of the whole thing. Sometimes the auditorium was always packed jammed with people standing at the back. It was a patronized thing, no matter whether you were in San Francisco or whether you were in Colorado Springs or in Boston. We were in Boston 3 nights. In the city of Boston, in various places in the city of Boston. We were 8 nights in New York City. I often look back on that and I think of the encores I took, and I think of that little pink dress that I had made, and I remember then the first Paris dress I think that I ever saw and bought because it was on sale. But it was a beautiful dress with a long train. It had ruffles and ruffles and ruffles. It was made of a satin material that one side was one color and the other side was a little different. It was real gorgeous. And between every one of those ruffles, there was a ruffle of Honiton lace. Now, Honiton lace was a specially imported lace from Paris. I know when we got into one town in Nebraska somewhere, there was a dreadful blizzard on, and the committee came to see whether we were going to be able to perform or not. To get there, it was awful. And the thing they said definitely was, we want your girls to wear those Paris gowns. They hadn't seen Paris gowns either, and you better wear your best clothes. That was a great experience. I learned, of course, much there. I learned what you had to do to hold an audience. I learned what the audience expected. And it was a great experience. We were 3 seasons on the Lyceum circuit. We were listed up into Sitka, Alaska, where they were going to pay $500 for us for that one night. Well, we took that inside passage. We'd all been in the hospital. I'd been in the hospital. They'd lanced my throat 11 times one night so I could breathe. As soon as I could make a sound and all, we were back on the road. And here we were on the road to Sitka, Alaska. And I went up there this summer to find how far we got. And I don't know yet how far we got till the boat had stopped because we were massed into ice. And there ahead of us was a 40-mile dog sled trip, which Mr. Cutter refused to make because the 2 women in the company had just got out of hospitals, and he was afraid we would die on his hands. So we never did get there until this summer, and now I don't know how far the ship got.
Do you remember some of the repertoire, some of the numbers that you used, that you gave?
On that particular one, I can't remember the names of them at the instant, but I do remember that as we got into the Mormon territory, there was one number that I had to cut out because we were getting into Mormon territory. I remember that we had a special program on Sunday night, and on Sunday night, it was a religious program, and I remember there was one night in Pennsylvania when I saw a baby leave its mother's lap and come crawling down the aisle toward me, a little guy. And I walked to the front of the stage and picked him up and held him while I finished that number. And of course they just cheered and cheered over that. I can't remember the names of them, but later I do remember this, that they used to pay me $100 a night, 2 of us, for In a Garden with the Strauss music. That was quite an accomplishment. I mean, I liked that number. That was...
Those musical readings, we used to call them, that were done with musical accompaniment, were usually very effective, I thought. Audiences nearly always appreciated them. Among your travels, where did you perhaps receive your greatest ovation?
Sometimes it was in the most unexpected. I remember in Boston, I took 8 encores in Boston in that little pink dress that I had made myself. In Salt Lake City, the audience in a big theater, it was a beautiful theater, stood and just cheered and cheered. You never knew where. I remember there was once we were in the mining territory of Pennsylvania, the deep mines of Pennsylvania, where we went down in the mine during the day, the deepest mine I was ever in. And that night, they cheered us, and they were the miners. And men who had been down under the world mining were in that audience, and their laughter was so appreciative. It wasn't ugly laughter, it was beautiful laughter. They really thought it was funny, if it was supposed to be funny. Some audiences would weep most delightfully. Where you got these responsive audiences, they were just as unexpected to me. I couldn't tell you where they were the most appreciated. It was like teaching here in Alva. We did one during the war. We did a play called, I don't know what it was called, I forgot. Anyway, in the end, there was in the middle of it, somewhere there was one single voice came in off stage with the Star-Spangled Banner. It was during the war. And the lead in that play had been subpoenaed to come to the war, and here I had a play just ready to go, and he was playing the lead in it. And I went to the president and I said, is there anything on earth I can do? He's been called right now, and I can't produce this play without him. And he said, there's not a thing you can do. And I said, do you care if I try? And he said, oh, no, I don't care if you try, but you can't do anything. Anyway, I thought, poor me, to go up against the United States Army. I've never done it. I don't know why or how. But anyway, and I don't know what I did. I can't answer what I did. But I made a plea and told them that we were going to sell bonds, and we had that. That was a part of it. And we were doing this play that was a patriotic play. And in it was this place where this Star-Spangled Banner, this one voice began on it. And it was, maybe that was the end of the play anyway. I thought, as the audience, if I could just make it so strong that the audience would stand when that first notes of that came. So we worked on that so hard. But I was going to say, the Army gave in to poor little me, and he left that night after the play, and we sold $30,000 worth of bonds that night. And but this getting the audience to stand and was something that I didn't know how you could do. But anyway, when that note came, that audience rose like one, and tears were just rolling down everybody's face. You never know what's going to make them work. It just comes unexpectedly. If you've done a good job, you get the audience. And if you don't get the audience, you don't go over. They don't have you again.
Do you remember the name of this individual that sang, the one who was so impressive? Yeah. And the one?
Her name is now Winifred. She was Winifred Parker. She was Winifred Parker then. Cook. She's Winifred Cook now.
The gentleman who got out of the army.
Lester Meyer. Lester Meyer.
He was saved by the bell. After that. Yeah. I believe that We have not yet touched on your marriage, or your name is Bingham. Where does that come in?
Well, it's a kind of a beautiful story. I had a debater, one of my students, Floyd Bingham. Was a very handsome young man, and I was quite severe with him in making him. I figured if I got a debate team ready, they ought to win it. And that's my theory yet. If I send a debate team out, which I never will again because I'm too old, but if I sent a debate team, I said, you're ready, go win it. That's what. And he was one of my debaters. And, of course, he won. And by and by, toward the end of the year, I was 5 years older than he was. But I knew that there was something going off center. And that was that I thought he was the most beautiful creature, and he was the loveliest person I ever knew. And he seemed to be feeling that way about him. And I told him, I'm leaving, I'm going around the world. And when I'm going to be gone a year at least, if you feel this way, when I come back, we'll talk about it again. And that's when I went to Honolulu. And when we came back, we did get married. And we had 2 children. And our son today owns 4 newspapers in Texas. And he was 5 years in the war and came out of it with nothing bad except that his mind was pretty well shot he didn't like the idea of killing. I don't think he has my gun out there now, but I don't believe he'd shoot it if he had to. He took it down because some animals were digging up his yard, and he took it down, but he has it in his office in the showcase. That's all. The only time I ever knew him was when his grandmother, whom he worshipped, was very ill, and she couldn't eat any Thanksgiving dinner. And he said, Grams, could you eat some quail broth if I'd get you a quail? Well, he came with the quail, and we made the broth, but she still couldn't eat it. And grandmother went on and died, and he worshipped his grandmother. And I don't believe he would kill a quail if you were to offer him $1,000. I don't think he would. He was not built for war. And he had quite a run with liquor. He came from the war just wanting to forget it. And then he finally just quit it entirely and put himself in the hospital and plunked down his own $1,500 for 2 weeks treatment. And yes, and I haven't seen any evidences of any since he's had these. And my girl, died of rheumatic fever, which I'd run from everything else, diphtheria and all that sort of thing, but I never heard of rheumatic fever. But I now have her buried up here in the cemetery in Alva. She was buried for 42 years in Wichita. Yes, I have 3 of wonderful grandchildren, 2 girls have married young men who were in the service. One of them is still in Okinawa. One of them is down here in Florida. And I have a grandson who has his doctor's degree and is teaching in Weatherford.
And when he was getting his doctor's degree, I got to tell this is bragging, pure and simple. The president wrote to his parents congratulating him that he had passed all of his doctor's exams with the highest grades they had ever given in that university in Carbondale, Illinois, southern Illinois. But then his mother was graduated from law school, cum laude, the first time they'd given that in 30 years. So it runs in that side of the family, not mine.
He couldn't have helped it with both sides like that. Do you think of anything else? We have a few minutes here. Do you think of something else now that you would like to relate? This is such an interesting period.
Nothing much, but I'm proud today that I have had the opportunity to work as I have with these marvelous young people. I believe I'm the richest woman in the world, barring none. Now, I'm not so flush with money, but the money my father left me, I think I have tripled it in my lifetime, number one. The colleges have been so good to me. This college that paid me $75 a month for those years, and I left because I was so ashamed of it, still carries me on their payroll. I have never felt it was right to belong to any of these groups that want to demand more than they're worth. I'm proud of the work my students have done. I'm proud of all of the things we've had.
About how many students do you suppose you have had?
I can't answer that, except I can tell you this. I was complaining one time to some of my students that I cannot remember their names. And they said, "Do you know how many students you have had?" And I said, "I have no idea." And they said, "We were talking about it the other night. You have had over 10,000 students." And I said, "No wonder I don't." So I quit complaining at me.
Well, this has been such a wonderful interview. I have enjoyed it so much. Thank you. I hope it hasn't been too tiring for you. And you have had such a rich life, so full and such wonderful experience. And just think of the influence that you have had here in Oklahoma as well all over the world. But the people here, I know this tape is going to be one of our most popular ones. Thank you so much.
I want to tell you this. I have not taught now for 20 years since I retired, for I am 85 and proud of it. My students had a party this college had a party honoring me at the 75th anniversary they're having here. That's the old ones who have come back to say, "Where is Mrs. Bingham? We want to find Mrs. Bingham." I think of one thing. A little girl was in my class. Then she went out here to Beaver County and married, had 4 babies in a row, and 3 big droughts in a row where they couldn't make a living. She came back and she was hunting every place for the little theater and Miss Bingham. We had, in the meantime, moved from the 3rd floor over to our department on the 2nd floor. And when she came to me, I said, "What did you remember about Mrs. Bingham and the little theater that made you want to hunt us?" She said, "Oh, it was the hard work and the good times we had." I thought it was.
That was a sweet tribute. And on that note, we will close. This is Mary B. Roberts completing this wonderful interview with Mrs. Bingham. And thank you so much. This is October 24th, 1972, Alva, Oklahoma. Thank you.